I'd given a few talks, and then Mike rang up and said that there was some possibly money available from the Decade of Centenaries. So I applied for that. And yeah, that's all they do, and have lunch. That's it. And and I suppose I suppose one of the things that had annoyed me over the Decade of Centenaries was that there had been this, in a way, erasure of what had happened up north in terms of the cultural preparations, and I think there was still a kind of reluctance to accept that a lot of preparation had happened in that sphere. And I think the figures I've always been interested in remain the figures who really aren't allowed a real positioning in the narrative, especially the intellectual narrative. And I think that I always found frustrating. And so as I watched the Decade of Centenaries continue, I was kind of conscious that, you know, there was, I mean, even the Atlas of the Irish Revolution, a figure like Alice Stopford Green, who is a hugely kind of active organizer in London, and then subsequently in Ireland. She writes 3 histories that are absolutely key to building a sense of historical consciousness around independence. There's not a single reference to her in the Atlas of the Irish Revolution. I think there's one, she's mentioned in one photograph. And so, you know, and Bulmer Hobson, there is a bit about Bulmer. I was conscious of Marnie Hayes' work very much, and very good work it is. But also what I found difficult to accept around the politics of commemoration was the way a figure like Hobson, who had played a critical part in the organizing up to 1916, and then, as I say in the film, had been to some extent erased because of the position he took at that critical moment. Then he re-emerges and becomes a really positive element within the new Free State. And that really hasn't been recognized. And it would be interesting to see what happens over the next few years, because things like Civic Week and those big early moments of sort of state pageantry were part of his own contribution in that first decade. And then I suppose as the world extremified in the 1930s, you know, Hobson remains quite moderate. He'd always been part of a left positioning within nationalism. I was very, graciously given access to the papers and books that were beside him when he died. And he'd handed over most of his library and his papers, he'd handed over most of his papers to the National Library of Ireland in the late 50s. And he had sold his books through the book dealer in Galway, Kenny's, through Kenny's. Unfortunately, they didn't make a list, but Des Kenny remembered as a boy going out to Roundstone and with his, with I think his father, and evaluating Bulmer's library this would have been in the very early 60s. And he did remember making quite a funny comment, because Bulmer was incredibly blind by that stage and wore sort of very, very thick glasses. And Des said to his father, "Why does a man who's almost blind own so many books?" Which was... but Bulmer was a powerful intellectual. And again, you get frustrated moments. There was a documentary that RTE produced, I think, with the BBC, for the Decade of Centenaries on Owen MacNeill. And Bulmer Hobson obviously appears in that, but he is this sort of absolutely stereotypical IRB man. You know, he comes into MacNeill's life with his sort of hat pulled down over his forehead and his sort of collar pulled up around his neck, and, you know, comes in like, you know, the gunman. And he just wasn't that figure. I mean, he is part of this. So I suppose one of the things that John, to speak to what John said this morning, I suppose one of the essential issues I suppose I had with commemoration was the fact that historians were in many ways given too central a positioning within the whole narration of what was happening. And I think that in the end, as the decade went on, saw a smaller and smaller coterie of figures who were actually speaking on the behalf of the state, and in a way kind of navigating it through those very, very turbulent moments, of course, to do with the RIC commemoration, and most obviously to do with the Wall of Remembrance too, which I suppose is something we have to talk about at some point today. And again, my own reading was of that was that in some ways there had been some effort to really look at that, in a way, that longer history in terms of the shadow state, but there hadn't been enough, in a way, foregrounding of the shadow state, especially when the state comes into being in 1922. So I really found it very odd, actually, the discussion around the founding of the Free State in 22, because there had been decades of preparation in many ways. I mean, Quaylene's paper, to some extent, was a kind of case study of the beginnings of a sort of, in a way, a business community. You could see that a lot of those figures, again, who were part of a Protestant network who opposed the Free State, but some came in behind it, but certainly were committed to 1916, or certainly the Irish independence movement. They were nowhere to be seen. Robert Barton, Childers. I mean, Childers is a really huge figure in that decade before 1916, a framework for home rule, which becomes an absolute kind of template in many ways for a lot of the kind of complex thinking about how the state's going to come into being. There was very, very little treatment of that. Again, I'm sorry to say, John, I know you were part of that project, but the Atlas of the Irish Revolution, you know, it doesn't really go there. And you can see, in a way, what I think is really interesting about the Decade of Centenaries is to really see where the erasures are still happening. So that my view really at the end of the decade is that what we really need to start doing is to start, on one level, reading it for what is still being blocked out, why it's being blocked out, and in a way, who's responsible for it being blocked out. And I think that requires those good historians you speak about, in a way, becoming more honest about, in a way, the politics of their own engagement with the Irish past in terms of what it means in the present. And then I think the other thinking I have over all of it is that I think we are beginning to teach. I'm not completely, maybe, or certainly we're continuing to promote in a way a version of the past that I really wonder if it's really fit for purpose for the future, in the sense that, you know, whatever one thinks about the development of professional history over the last 40 years in terms of the politics of it, it has very much been framed around the promotion of some specific positions and the shutting out and the screening out of other positions. And I think the screening out of those other positions now just can't be allowed to continue, because otherwise I think that in a way history is going to actually argue itself into its own ultimate downfall through actually just not really representing what the kind of history that needs to be written. And I think that is partly because we have just got so used to blocking the North out of our consciousness that we really just still don't really want to conceptualize it as a critical part of that early 20th century shadow state in the making. Look, those are my thoughts for what they're worth. But I suppose in the end, just to bring it back to Bulmer, is that I think Bulmer in many ways represents someone who was, you know, prepared to put arms into the volunteers, recognized that Ireland had to, in different ways, pressurize the empire to break with regard to its own sovereignty, question of sovereignty, but at the end of the day was prepared to become a very committed figure within the new Free State, but at the same time always recognizing that, as Collins was always prepared to say, you know, it was a stepping stone. And I think in the end, we have to actually start now thinking about a history that actually takes us that one last step. Because we all know it's inevitably going to happen, but I don't think history in many ways is helping that transition get over the line. Okay, that's I don't know if anyone has any thoughts about the film.
Could I ask you if we have time?
Sure.
Do you expect to see a united Ireland in your lifetime, and how should we now proceed to accomplish that?
Yeah, I think it's so complicated. I think so many people want a united Ireland. I mean, again, one of the other narratives I've already looked at is the huge support in England for Irish independence during the War of Independence and afterwards. And again, that narrative has been blocked out of our own understanding of the period. You know, there was this thing called the Peace with Ireland Council, which was tremendously well endorsed by really senior political figures in Britain at that time. Had mass appeal. There were hundreds of meetings arranged in a relatively short period between essentially from Balbriggan and Terence McSweeney's death through to the signing of the truce in July 1922. You read the contemporary history of that period. There's Peace with Ireland Council is nowhere there. Even in the books that are talking about, Irish republicanism and nationalism in London, don't really go there. So I think these are the kinds of narratives that need to actually be brought in to a kind of broader understanding of actually what's happening. I don't know about a united Ireland. I mean, I've read a lot of the stuff on it, and there is a deep complexity around how that is actually going to be achieved, just on a constitutional level. But I mean, what we are witnessing is that the northern state is a failed state. You know, it just isn't working, and it's not working because Britain still wants to ignore it. Really, it's not working for a whole number of reasons. So it might well happen. I haven't got that long to live, probably. So it's rather a kind of I would have to answer no, probably. Well, I mean, you know, I don't know how long I'll live, or how quickly it will happen.